Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about my journey, my choice to journey with Dungeons and Dragons and abandon playing Dungeons and Dragons. I no longer play Dungeons and Dragons, I journey with Dungeons and Dragons. It's a different level of Dungeons and Dragons experience. Do you want to spend time with some people who are going to make, male genitalia jokes and not take the game, serious and just do a beer and pretzels goblin cutting? Or do you want to really dive into important stories that explore identity, narrative, and language, right? Do you want to take Dungeons and Dragons further, and do you want to allow Dungeons and Dragons to take you further, right? Do you want to reach a point where you stop playing Dungeons and Dragons and you begin journeying with Dungeons and Dragons? If you do, I'm going to tell you the actual steps I took to do it, right? So I do not play Dungeons and Dragons. I journey with Dungeons and Dragons. So how did I get there? What were the actionable steps I took to do it, right? Well, here's the second one, right? And it is, I declared my loyalty for Dungeons and Dragons. I've been doing this for years. Indirectly, I'm going to do it directly right now. I declare my loyalty for Dungeons and Dragons. What does that mean, right? Well, I declared it publicly, and now I'm going to execute it. You know how I execute it? By actually supporting Dungeons and Dragons and upping Dungeons and Dragons and celebrating Dungeons and Dragons and promoting Dungeons and Dragons and allying with Dungeons and Dragons and celebrating the creators of Dungeons and Dragons and celebrating the owners of Dungeons and Dragons and celebrating the guardians of Dungeons and Dragons and celebrating the people who are the history of Dungeons and Dragons, right? Not having my channel dedicated to downing Dungeons and Dragons every possible turn. Right? Bob Wilder, World Builder. I love Dungeons and Dragons. Now I beg you to let me talk to you about every game under the sun other than Dungeons and Dragons. Cairn and DCC. Or I love Dungeons and Dragons. I just want to really make sure that you understand I'd rather talk to you about any game in the world except Dungeons and Dragons. Right? So what do we mean by declaring loyalty for Dungeons and Dragons, right? You are actually supporting Dungeons and Dragons, right? Which means that Hasbro gets an extension of the same goodwill that you give to the product of Dungeons and Dragons, that you give to the life brand of Dungeons and Dragons, that you give to the lifestyle of Dungeons and Dragons, right? That you extend that same goodwill, that same love, that same courtesy to Hasbro, who is the creators of Dungeons and Dragons. And when they send the Pinkertons to recover Dungeons and Dragons components that were going to be dropped, that were going to be exposed a month before the street date, you don't castigate them for it, right? When they're, so basically, when they're going to have a Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves global blockbuster attempt to create a brand new Dungeons and Dragons cinematic universe, you don't come out 9 days beforehand and do a video saying, "Remember everybody, Dungeons and Dragons movies suck," right? If you actually declare that you love Dungeons and Dragons, you don't just say it, you do it, right? And you celebrate when Dungeons and Dragons has Honor Among Thieves and has an awesome new show, or has a new movie, or has a cool new toy, or has a new Lego set, or has a new Funko Pop, or has a new Dungeons and Dragons Magic the Gathering card. You celebrate it and you promote it and you tell the world Dungeons and Dragons is awesome. You don't complain constantly. You don't down the guardians of Dungeons and Dragons. You don't complain about the way the rules are designed. You don't complain about the art. You don't complain about the layout. You don't go meh when a new D&D canon hardback drops. You actually celebrate it. You make sure that your words, when you declare your loyalty to Dungeons and Dragons, match your actions, right? And so this is really critical. So I have declared my loyalty to Dungeons and Dragons. And that means I ride with Dungeons and Dragons. When Hasbro does something epic, like Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves, I celebrate with them. When they make a misstep, I defend them. And I remember, and I remind people, right? They make mistakes because they're moving at the speed of light. They actually get done They get more done before 9 a.m. than most TTRPG companies get before the whole day is done. They've accomplished things multiple times that many, there's not a single tabletop role-playing game in the country. There's not a single tabletop role-playing game in America, company in America, who has done 2 American blockbuster silver screen attempts. Not one, right? They are unmatched. They are unmatched, right? And I ride with D&D. And I am here to protect and defend and sentinel for Dungeons & Dragons as a brand, Dungeons & Dragons as a lifestyle, Dungeons & Dragons as a life brand, Dungeons & Dragons as a product, and I am with the people who create Dungeons & Dragons. They are not separate. Dungeons & Dragons is awesome because Hasbro made it awesome for 25 years, longer than any other company in the world dedicated to it, right? TSR began it, and it did the best it could to make Dungeons & Dragons create. Wizards of the Coast had it for 2 years between 1997 and 1999. They flipped it like a stock. There was no love there. And Hasbro came in and dropped it like it was hot and took care of Dungeons & Dragons and has cared for it as a loving parent, in my humble opinion, for 25 years. And I am 24 now, I guess. And I, longer than any other company, and I owe a debt to Hasbro. I ride with them. I support them. I promote them. I defend them. That's what it means to declare your loyalty to Dungeons & Dragons. And then you make your actions match your words. Right? So that is a step you take to abandon playing Dungeons & Dragons, like a large amount of people do, right? Just a lower level, a less valuable level of participation with Dungeons & Dragons. But if you want to step up and journey with Dungeons & Dragons, change yourself and change Dungeons & Dragons itself, this is the next actionable step that you have the ability, I have bushwhacked this path. You now have the ability to walk behind me if you choose. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.